of ICSA, and I've been involved in this field. I stumbled into a career almost 40 years ago. I'm going to talk about the concept of hell from somewhat of a historical perspective to give some context, and Bob is going to get into some of the theological issues. And the main thesis I have is that the concept of hell as a place of eternal punishment, or torture even, may tell us more about humankind than it tells us about God. And some reasons why. Eternal punishment after death. This did not begin with Christianity. The ancient Greeks had the concept, and I know you can't read this probably. In older Greek myths, the realm of Hades is the misty and gloomy abode of the dead, where all mortals go when they die. Very few mortals could leave Hades once they entered. The exception were heroes. There were different sections of Hades. This is part of Greek myth. And there are a couple of examples I'm pulling out to give some context as to why this concept of hell as a torture chamber antedates Christianity. Some of you may remember the legend of Prometheus, who gave mankind fire. He stole fire from Mount Olympus, which really pissed Zeus off. So Zeus decided he was going to punish him. So he chained Prometheus to a rock. And every day an eagle, which represented Zeus, would come to tear open his flesh and eat Prometheus's liver. Every night the liver would regrow, only to be devoured again the next day. In this way, his torture was never-ending. For all eternity, Prometheus would have his liver eaten, and it would regrow and be eaten again. And the myth of Sisyphus is another example. The French philosopher, existentialist philosopher Albert Camus has a great little essay called The Myth of Sisyphus. And that myth is, once a king of Ephyra, or Corinth, Sisyphus was said to be murderous, selfish, and deceitful. He would trap and kill travelers and take pleasure in their deaths. His iron-fisted rule and cruel manipulations went unchallenged until Sisyphus betrayed Zeus by leaving the secret location of a hidden water nymph. So again, Zeus is upset. Zeus gave King Sisyphus the most maddening eternal punishment. He was forced to endlessly push a giant boulder up the steep mountain. The boulder was cursed to fall down the mountain each time Sisyphus got tantalizingly near the top. The result was an eternity of useless effort and continuous frustration. Okay, so that's something that I'm sure a lot of fire and brimstone preachers might be able to relate to. That sounds like a pretty good punishment. And the Greek myths and that concept carried over into Christianity, and you see it most poetically and vividly in Dante's Inferno. Dante Alighieri was an Italian poet of around 1300 who wrote the Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy. The first section of it was the Inferno, which, at least in the old days, most college students would have read. But there was also the Purgatorio and the Paradiso. And it was an allegorical conception of, in large part, Aquinas' thought. But it was an allegory. And yet it was so compelling in its imagery and the vividness of the imagery that I would maintain that it had an effect, a cultural effect, over the centuries. Dante, and as an example, I'm taking Bertrand de Bon. Dante selects a troubadour poet for the defining example of contrapasso, which is the logical relationship between the sin and its punishment in hell. Because de Bon allegedly instigated a rift between King Henry II of England and his son, the young Prince Henry, Bertrand is now himself physically divided. He carries his decapitated head, which though separated from the body, inexplicably manages to speak. It's really one of the most powerful sections of Dante's Inferno. And this is, I think, a painting by William Blake, or a drawing by William Blake. And you see Bertrand de Ban holding his severed head, and the head speaks. You know, by the hair it held the head dissevered, hung down from the hand in fashion of a lantern, and that upon us gazed and said, "Oh me." Okay, and the Divine Comedy, the Inferno, is full of this kind of powerful imagery about hell. And you can see William Blake in his painting. You have these suffering people, and the two standing figures are Dante and Virgil, his guide through hell. Virgil was a noble pagan who was in the limbo section of hell, where there wasn't suffering, but because they weren't Christian, they couldn't go to heaven. Okay, and that had, I think, an impact over the centuries. And I say in this one, until recent years, virtually all educated persons read Dante. T.S. Eliot, around the turn of the century, said, "Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them. There is no other." Even though his poem was an allegory, the power of his imagery in the Inferno surely affected concepts of hell. The sermon, you see this, James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man has a sermon that will make your skin curl. It's one of the most beautiful fire and brimstone sermons, very powerful, and Joyce was such a great writer. And that was Ireland, so the question I raise here is, did religious teachers purposely exaggerate hell in order to persuade a largely uneducated population to be good? I think it's important to remember that throughout most of human history, most people were peasants. The vast majority were peasants. They were uneducated. And the educated people were the priests, and after the Reformation, the ministers, and some nobles and so on. They all studied Latin, they all studied the classics. I'm jumping to another slide. So the challenge was, how do you teach these peasants theology? And I think there was some techniques that we used that today we might consider questionable. And I got that little note, third grade nun, because when I was in the third grade, I went to Sunday school, like lots of Italian Catholic children, and I remember a nun who was talking to us about purgatory. Now, in purgatory, the punishment is very great, the pain is great, but at least you're going to get to heaven. It may take you a long time, but you're going to get there. In hell, it's eternal. And the nun told the story of a man who would ask a priest to say a mass after his death. And the man died, and within a day, the priest was getting ready to start the mass. And the man appeared to the priest, and he said, "Father, you told me that you would say a mass right away." And the priest said, "Father, I've been here for 5 years." And the nun said, "The punishment of purgatory is so intense that one day seems like 5 years." Okay. And I think in her mind, if I'm going to get these little monsters to be good, I better scare the bejesus out of them. And it worked, because I remember it today from when I was 8 years old. And I wonder how much of the concept of hell is due to perhaps well-intentioned people scaring basically making religious campfire stories to scare the hell out of kids. And also, until the 20th century, virtually all educated persons studied Latin, Greek, and the classical myths and authors. They all knew them. They knew the classics the way today's young people know contemporary culture. They can tell you all about the rap artists and the movie stars, but probably most of them today have no idea who Dante was. Sisyphus, Prometheus, the Greek myths, they're not even taught in schools today. But the culture that we inherited was steeped in that kind of literature. And the concept of hell that was communicated in that, I think, had an impact. But an impact that isn't always recognized as having that cultural context. Also, approaching my thesis from a different angle, you look at the history of punishment, and it tells a lot about human beings. We forget that punishments the modern world would consider barbaric were socially acceptable through most of human history. And there's an interesting timeline of punishments that I found online. Crucifixion, everybody knows about crucifixion because of Jesus Christ, but the Romans used it as a method of persecution. In the slave uprising of Spartacus, I think they crucified thousands along the Appian Way. That was outlawed in 337, probably when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. I'm not going to go through all of these, I've highlighted a few. In 1401, England, a law makes burning the punishment of heresy, and Joan of Arc was burned shortly thereafter in France. 1531, in England, a law makes boiling alive the punishment for poisoners. Okay, 1735, the last man in Britain to be pressed to death dies in Horsham. Jump to 1790, burning to death is finally abolished in Britain. Now, to give you some context, that's 14 years after the Declaration of Independence, 3 years after the American Constitution. Britain was the superpower of the world at that time, and yet burning as a punishment had been allowed. 1792, the guillotine is introduced in France. Now, we think the guillotine is pretty barbaric, but it was actually supposed to be a merciful way of executing people, because it's quick, you know, it's just scary as hell until that blade hits your neck. And then 1827, breaking on the wheel, where they rip you apart, is abolished in Germany. 1829, branding with hot irons was abolished in Britain. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony had already played, and yet they were branding with hot irons and breaking people with the wheel. So you have this, in a sense, contradiction. You have these cultural progress made that's uplifting, and at the same time you have this kind of ghoulish sense of punishment of people. 1870, this is the one that I think really captures it. In Britain, hanging, drawing, and quartering is abolished. Now, in hanging, drawing, and quartering, the person is first hung, but not enough to kill him. Then he's disemboweled, and then 4 horses rip his limbs apart. Now, 1870, it was banned. The Impressionists were beginning to make beautiful paintings in France, and that was the punishment for treason. And I remember watching the Netflix thing on the young Victoria. They mentioned that because someone had been accused of treason. So that was a punishment. And you notice in the drawing, it's public. And hangings were public. You know, people would go to hangings to watch the hanging. So what does this tell us about the culture that we all inherited? The culture said, you do something bad, and something bad happens to you. And if you do something really bad, something really bad is going to happen to you. And continuing, the guillotine is used for the last time in France, 1977. I was in graduate school, and the last time the guillotine was used. And 1987, corporal punishment is abolished in state schools in Britain and private schools in 1999. When I was in elementary school, we still had what we called the rattan, and I was a good boy, so I never got the rattan. But I had friends who, they would be punished. You did something wrong, you go to the principal's office, and it was like a bendable stick, and it hurt, because kids would cry. And then you'd hold your hand out. And the thing that's interesting about punishment is the person being punished bought into the mentality. Kids would, I did something bad, I gotta be punished. And I remember old westerns and so on, you know, fathers, you know, if you don't behave yourself, I'm going to take my belt off and take you to the woodshed, and I'm going to have to beat you. So this notion of punishment is so ingrained in culture, you know, and it isn't just the West. I mean, this is universal for humankind, that the question arises, is this really telling us about God? Which I restate my thesis, the concept of hell as a place of eternal punishment, of torture even, may tell us more about humankind than about God.